October 17th, 1943, somewhere over the Austrian Alps. Flight Lieutenant James McKenzie felt the Lancaster bomber shudder as German flak tore through the starboard wing. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, and through the smoke filling the cockpit, he saw the altimeter spinning downward. 3,000 feet, 2,000. The order came through his headset, barely audible over the screaming wind. Bail out. Bail out now. He pulled the ripcord at 800 feet, the parachute deploying with a violence that nearly snapped his spine. Below him, the Austrian countryside spread out in the pale moonlight, a patchwork of farms and forest that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. He could see his bomber, a flaming meteor arcing toward the earth. Somewhere in that inferno were 3 men who hadn't made it out. The landing shattered his left ankle. He hit the ground in a wheat field, the impact driving the breath from his lungs, pain exploding up his leg like white fire. He lay there for perhaps 5 minutes, listening to the distant sound of his aircraft's death, trying to breathe through the agony. The German soldiers found him at dawn. 3 Wehrmacht infantrymen, middle-aged men with tired eyes, not the fanatical SS troops he had feared. One of them, a Feldwebel with gray at his temples, looked at Mackenzie's twisted ankle and shook his head. Englander? Scottish, Mackenzie managed through gritted teeth. The Feldwebel smiled slightly. For you, the war is over. Mackenzie would remember those words with bitter irony. The war was not over. For him, it was just beginning. They carried him to a Wehrmacht field hospital, where a German doctor set his ankle with professional competence. After 3 weeks, when the ankle had healed enough for him to walk with a crutch, they transferred him to his first prison, a medieval fortress near Linz called Schloss Hartheim. The fortress was a study in medieval brutality adapted for modern purposes. 40 men crammed into rooms built for 10. A single bucket for sanitation. Food twice daily, a thin soup that might contain potatoes or turnips. Occasionally, a fragment of meat so small it seemed like mockery. The cold seeped through stone walls with a dampness that settled into bones and lungs. Mackenzie spent his days learning the rhythms of captivity. Morning roll call that lasted hours in the courtyard, regardless of weather. Long, empty afternoons when boredom became its own form of torture. Evenings when men gathered to talk about home, voices growing quiet as the lights went out. He met squadron leader Peter Holland on his second day at Hartheim. Holland had been shot down over France 3 months earlier, a hurricane pilot with hard eyes and a reputation among the prisoners for escape attempts. He had tried twice already, caught both times within miles of the camp. They'll move us soon, Holland said quietly one evening. Permanent camps. Stalag Luft somewhere, probably in Germany proper. Once you're in those camps, escape becomes nearly impossible. We go now, or we don't go at all. So we go now, Mackenzie said. Holland's plan was simple. The fortress had a coal cellar that connected to a drainage tunnel leading outside the walls. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and the exit was covered by an iron grate. But Holland had been working on that grate for weeks, slowly loosening the bolts. They prepared methodically. Mackenzie traded his cigarette ration for a compass. Holland accumulated food, stealing crusts of bread, hoarding portions of evening soup. They would have perhaps 3 days' worth. November 12th, 1943. The night was moonless, heavy clouds obscuring even the stars. At 2 a.m., when the guards changed shifts, they made their move. Down the stone staircase to the coal cellar, moving like shadows. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind coal sacks. They pushed through into absolute blackness, crawling on their bellies through slime and standing water. The walls, so narrow, Mackenzie's shoulders scraped both sides simultaneously. The tunnel seemed endless. Mackenzie's ankles screamed with every movement. Water soaked through his uniform, icy against his skin. When they finally forced the grate open, the sound seemed impossibly loud, metal shrieking against stone. They froze, listening for alarm bells. Nothing. Only the wind moving through trees beyond the fortress walls. They crawled out into a drainage ditch. The fortress loomed above them, searchlights sweeping the grounds. But they were outside, beyond the walls, free for the first time in weeks. South, Holland whispered. Toward the mountains. We need distance before dawn. They moved through the Austrian night, heading for Yugoslavia and freedom. By dawn they had covered perhaps 8 miles, putting the Danube between themselves and the fortress. They found shelter in a barn, burrowing into hay in the loft. The dogs found them late the next afternoon. Mackenzie woke to barking, to shouted German commands. Wehrmacht soldiers surrounded the barn. There was no possibility of fight or flight. They spent 3 days in solitary confinement at Hartheim, locked in stone cells barely large enough to lie down in, without light, fed once daily on bread and water. The beating came on the 4th day. Nothing savage, just enough to drive home the consequences of defiance. Fists and boots professionally applied. Mackenzie took it silently, and when it was over, he lay on cold stone, breathing through broken ribs, planning his next attempt. On November 20th, they were transferred. 50 Allied airmen loaded onto a train, destination Stalag Luft III, near Sagan in Silesia, deep in Nazi Germany. The journey took 3 days, moving farther from freedom with each mile. Stalag Luft III was a revelation in the architecture of imprisonment. The camp sprawled across 140 acres of cleared forest, 6 compounds surrounded by double fences of barbed wire, guard towers every 100 yards, searchlights that turned night into day. The camp held over 10,000 Allied airmen, primarily British and American. Mackenzie was assigned to the North Compound. He shared a room with 11 others, including Holland, sleeping in triple-decker bunks. But beneath the surface routine, Stalag Luft III was a hive of escape activity. The camp contained some of the RAF's most experienced escapers, men who viewed imprisonment not as fate, but as challenge. Squadron leader Roger Bushell, known as Big X, ran the escape committee with military precision. A South African lawyer with a brilliant mind and iron will, Bushell had spent 3 years planning escape attempts. Holland introduced Mackenzie to him 3 weeks after their arrival. "Your record precedes you," Bushell said. "1 escape already. That shows determination. I'll go again, McKenzie said simply. Bushell smiled slightly. We're working on something. 3 tunnels, simultaneous excavation. Tom, Dick, and Harry. When they find one, we have backups. The tunnel system was an engineering marvel. Shafts 30 feet deep to avoid German seismic detectors, extending over 300 feet to reach the forest beyond the cleared zone. McKenzie volunteered immediately and was assigned to Harry, the tunnel running from Block 104. The work was brutal. Prisoners digging with improvised tools, shoring the tunnel with bedboards, hauling dirt back in bags made from long underwear, dispersing it carefully around the compound. McKenzie became a hauler, pulling sleds loaded with dirt through the narrow tunnel, crawling on his belly through claustrophobic darkness. His ankle throbbed constantly. The air was thick and foul, barely breathable despite their ingenious ventilation system. The winter of 1943 to 1944 passed in the rhythm of tunneling. Outside, the war ground on, was filtered into the camp through hidden radios. The tide was turning. The Russians were advancing. Invasion of France seemed imminent, but for the prisoners, these victories meant little. The tunnel became everything. In February 1944, disaster struck. The Germans found Tom. Ferrets swarmed the block, ripping up floorboards, confiscating tools. The camp fell into lockdown for a week, but they had found only one tunnel. Dick and Harry remained undiscovered. Bushell made the decision. Harry would go forward. Target date, late March. They would attempt to get 200 men out, the largest escape in POW camp history. McKenzie was on the list. Number 47. He spent the next weeks preparing with manic intensity, forging identity papers, sewing civilian clothes from scraps of uniform, memorizing his cover story, a French laborer traveling to Hamburg. March 24th, 1944, the night of the escape. McKenzie waited in Block 104 with dozens of other prisoners dressed in forged civilian clothes. At 9 p.m., the first man entered the tunnel. The plan was to move one man every minute. But immediately, problems emerged. The tunnel exit broke through several feet short of the forest, opening within sight of guard towers. McKenzie's turn came at 11:30 p.m. He crawled on through Harry for the last time, pulling himself through the long darkness, his heart hammering. The exit came suddenly, a square of darkness. Hands pulled him up and out into bitter cold. He lay in snow for a moment. Then someone whispered urgently, "Wait for the searchlight. When it passes, run." The searchlight swept past. McKenzie ran, his ankle screaming, expecting rifle fire. He reached the trees and kept running, crashing through underbrush. He ran for perhaps half a mile before stopping, lungs burning. He was in forest, deep forest. He was out. He was free. The plan was to reach the railway station at Sagan, 6 miles away, and catch the first train toward Frankfurt and Der Oder. From there, he would make his way north toward the Baltic coast and attempt to find a Swedish ship. He walked through the night following the compass, staying parallel to roads. Dawn came too quickly. He emerged from the forest on the outskirts of Sagan, just as the sun broke the horizon. The railway station was already busy with workers. Mackenzie joined the crowd, trying to look inconspicuous. His forged papers identified him as Marcel Dubois, French worker. He bought a ticket with Reichsmarks, scrounged in the camp. The train arrived at 6:45 a.m. He boarded a third-class car, sitting among German workers and Polish laborers. The train lurched forward, and Stalag Luft III began to recede behind him. But at 7:30 a.m., the train suddenly stopped. Through the window, he could see military vehicles racing along the parallel road, trucks full of Wehrmacht soldiers. The alarm had been raised. Minutes later, Gestapo agents boarded the train. They moved through the cars systematically, checking papers, studying faces. Mackenzie forced himself to remain calm, pretending to read a German newspaper. The Gestapo man who checked his papers was young, with cold blue eyes. He studied Mackenzie's forged documents for what seemed an eternity. Purpose of travel? Factory work in Hamburg. Mackenzie's German was halting, accented, but that was expected for a French laborer. Your hands. Mackenzie held them out. The agent examined them, looking for Wallace's, for signs of manual labor. Mackenzie's hands bore some calluses from tunnel work. It was enough. Wait here. The agent moved on. The train remained stopped for another hour while security forces searched every car. Finally, it lurched back into motion. Mackenzie allowed himself a small breath of relief, but the checkpoints continued throughout the day. At every station, more police, more document inspections. The net was tightening. By evening, he was exhausted and starving. He got off the train at Kustrin, a fortress city on the Oder River, and tried to find shelter. He found an abandoned warehouse near the river and collapsed onto the concrete floor. The Gestapo found him at dawn. He woke to flashlights in his face, to shouted commands, to rifle barrels pointed at his head. Royal Air Force, the Gestapo Hauptsturmführer asked in English. Mackenzie nodded. They interrogated him for hours at Gestapo headquarters. Who helped you escape? Where were you heading? Mackenzie gave only name, rank, and serial number. After 2 days, they transported him back to Stalag Luft III. The return journey felt like defeat worse than death. He had been free for 36 hours, had traveled almost 150 miles. Now he was returning to the same wire. The camp was in chaos. Of the 76 men who had escaped through Harry, the Germans had recaptured all but 3. And 50 of the recaptured men were missing, vanished into Gestapo custody. On March 29th, the camp commandant assembled all prisoners. His face was ashen as he read from an official document. 50 officers had been shot while resisting arrest or attempting further escape. The stunned silence that followed was the sound of hope dying. Squadron leader Roger Bushell was among the dead. So was Flight Lieutenant Johnny Bull. 50 names that had been living men 5 days earlier. Mackenzie felt something break inside him that day, Not his determination to escape. That remained unshaken. But his faith in some fundamental humanity. The Gestapo's mass execution proved that those rules no longer applied. In his diary that night, he wrote, "They have shown us what they are. We owe them nothing. The only duty remaining is to fight by any means possible." The camp administration reacted with predictable fury. Lockdowns, constant searches, new security measures. Escape became nearly impossible. But Mackenzie had learned something from those 36 hours of freedom. The way out wasn't through elaborate tunnels. It was through boldness, through speed, through taking advantage of chaos. Germany was collapsing. In its death throes, there would be opportunities. He spent the next months preparing, exercising, strengthening his ankle, building endurance, studying maps, memorizing railway routes, learning more German, accumulating supplies. In January 1945, as Russian armies approached from the east, the Germans made a decision. Stalag Luft III would be evacuated. All 10,000 prisoners marched westward. The order came on January 27th. Prepare to march in 24 hours. It was the opportunity Mackenzie had been waiting for: chaos, movement. In that confusion, a man might simply vanish. The march began on the night of January 28th, 1945. 10,000 men trudging through snow and subzero temperatures, heading west under guard. Men began falling within the first hours, collapsing from exhaustion and cold. Mackenzie walked in the middle of the column, conserving his strength, waiting for his moment. He had cached supplies in his pack: emergency rations, a compass, maps memorized. The opportunity came on the second night. The column had halted in a forest, prisoners collapsing where they stood. Guards were spread thin. Mackenzie simply walked away from the column, moving into the trees, stepping carefully to minimize tracks. He expected at any moment to hear shouts, to hear rifles crack. But there was nothing. The forest swallowed him, and he was free for the third time. He walked west through the night, guided by his compass, avoiding roads. At dawn, he found a barn and buried himself in hay. When he woke, he forced himself to eat a small portion of his rations and assess his situation rationally. He was perhaps 400 miles from American lines, he estimated. Between here and there lay the entirety of Nazi Germany. It was impossible. He would do it anyway. The journey became a blur of days and nights. He walked primarily at night, averaging 15 to 20 miles when weather permitted. During the day, he hid in forests, in abandoned buildings. Food became his obsession. His rations ran out after 5 days. He survived on what he could scavenge: frozen potatoes from farm cellars, turnips. Once a dead chicken he ate raw. His third camp came through capture. On February 10th, weak with hunger and hypothermia, he stumbled into a German army checkpoint near Görlitz. Wehrmacht soldiers pulled him from a snowbank and transported him to a temporary POW facility in a converted school. This camp was nothing like Stalag Luft III. No organization, no Geneva Convention niceties. Just hundreds of Allied prisoners crammed into unheated rooms, guarded by Wehrmacht soldiers who were themselves half-starved and demoralized. Mackenzie spent 2 weeks there, recovering his strength, waiting for his next opportunity. The camp held primarily American soldiers captured during the Battle of the Bulge. He taught them what he knew about captivity and escape. The fourth escape came on February 23rd. The camp was being evacuated. Prisoners loaded onto trains. In the chaos of loading, Mackenzie simply walked away, moving through the railway yard as if he belonged there. No one stopped him. He walked south this time, toward Czechoslovakia, partisan territory. The Czech countryside in winter was brutal. Mountains covered in snow, forests that seemed to stretch forever. He survived by becoming a ghost, sleeping in forests under piles of pine needles, trapping rabbits, boiling snow in a tin can. On March 8th, he encountered a group of Czech partisans in a forest near Liberec. They approached with rifles leveled. He raised his hands and spoke the one Czech phrase he had learned: "Jem britský voják." I am a British soldier. Their leader was a former Czech army officer named Marek. He spoke some English and questioned Mackenzie extensively. Finally satisfied, he offered shelter. "You can stay with us," Marek said. "Wait for the Americans or Russians. They cannot be far now." It was tempting. But Mackenzie had been a prisoner for 16 months. He had tasted freedom 3 times and lost it 3 times. He couldn't stop now. "I need to keep moving," he said, west, toward the American lines. Marek studied him for a long moment, then nodded. He provided Mackenzie with better clothes, food for perhaps a week, and something more valuable: information, maps, German strongpoints, partisan activity. "The Germans are pulling back everywhere," Marek said, "but they are also more dangerous now, more brutal. You must be very careful." Mackenzie left the partisan camp on March 10th, heading west toward the Bavarian border. The landscape shifted as he crossed into Bavaria. More open farmland, prosperous villages. But everywhere were signs of the Reich's collapse. Military convoys clogging roads, refugees streaming in both directions, deserters hiding in forests. Mackenzie became one more refugee among thousands. He joined groups traveling west, posing as a displaced Czech worker. No one questioned him closely. Everyone had their own desperate story. On March 15th, he was caught for the 4th time. He had joined a group of refugees crossing a bridge over the Danube near Regensburg when American fighter bombers appeared overhead, strafing the bridge. In the panic, Wehrmacht soldiers began rounding up military-age men. His forged papers weren't good enough. The Wehrmacht Feldwebel, examining them, noticed discrepancies. "British?" he asked quietly. Mackenzie nodded. They took him to a Wehrmacht barracks in Regensburg. The barracks held hundreds of prisoners, not just Allied soldiers, but also German deserters. The conditions were appalling. No heat, minimal food. But this was Mackenzie's 4th camp, and he was learning that each had vulnerabilities. The Wehrmacht guards were demoralized, exhausted. They knew the war was lost. He made contact with an American paratrooper named Jack Morrison, who had tried escaping twice already. They planned meticulously. The barracks had a coal cellar, that connected to the city's medieval sewer system. On March 20th, as Allied artillery began shelling Regensburg's outskirts, they made their move. The guards were distracted by the bombardment. McKenzie and Morrison, along with 3 other prisoners, forced the cellar door and descended into the sewers. The tunnel system was a nightmare of darkness and filth, water flowing ankle deep. But it led away from the barracks, under the city streets, toward freedom. After what seemed like hours, they emerged on the riverbank in the industrial section of Regensburg. "The Americans can't be more than a few miles away," Morrison said, listening to the sound of the guns. "We just need to get across the river and head toward the shelling." But the bridges were all guarded. They couldn't cross openly. McKenzie studied the river, calculating. The Danube was wide here, flowing fast with spring melt. The water would be near freezing. "We find a boat," McKenzie said. They searched the riverbank, and near a damaged boatyard found what they needed: wooden planks, empty fuel drums, rope. Working quickly, they lashed together a crude raft. At 3 a.m., they pushed the raft into the river and climbed aboard. The current grabbed them immediately, spinning the raft, pulling them downstream. They paddled desperately with boards, icy water splashing over them. The crossing took perhaps 10 minutes, but felt eternal. One of the prisoners slipped off the raft and disappeared into the dark water. There was no possibility of rescue. They paddled harder, fighting the current. They grounded on a muddy bank perhaps half a mile downstream. 3 men remained. They stumbled ashore and immediately began moving away from the city, toward the sound of the American guns. Dawn found them in farmland west of Regensburg, hiding in a drainage ditch while Wehrmacht units streamed past, retreating westward. German discipline was collapsing completely now. "We're close," Morrison whispered. "The American lines can't be more than a few miles ahead." But those few miles proved the most dangerous. The space between German retreat and American advance was a no-man's land of artillery fire and desperate Wehrmacht units making last stands. On March 21st, they were caught in an artillery barrage. American 155mm howitzers firing at German positions, shells screaming overhead. They threw themselves flat in a muddy field. Shrapnel whined through the air. The noise was apocalyptic. When it finally stopped, Morrison wasn't moving. McKenzie crawled to him, saw the shrapnel wound in his chest, the blood soaking through his shirt. "Did we make it?" Morrison asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Almost," McKenzie said. "Just a little further." Morrison smiled slightly. "Tell them I tried." He died there, 200 yards from American lines. McKenzie closed his eyes and said a prayer, then forced himself to stand and keep moving. He walked alone now. The other 2 prisoners had disappeared during the barrage. He walked west through a landscape of devastation, past burning vehicles and abandoned equipment. He walked through the morning and into the afternoon. At 3:30 p.m., he crested a small hill and saw them. American soldiers, a platoon of infantry from the 3rd Army, establishing a defensive position in a village. He could see the distinctive helmets, hear American voices. He was perhaps 500 yards away. He stood on that hilltop for a long moment, unable to quite believe it was real. After 16 months of captivity, after 4 camps, after 5 escape attempts, after walking over 600 miles through occupied Europe, freedom was 500 yards ahead. He began walking down the hill, slowly, his hands raised high, shouting in English, "British officer! Royal Air Force! Don't shoot!" American soldiers spun toward him, rifles leveled. He kept walking, too exhausted to run, too close to freedom to stop. An American sergeant came forward cautiously. "Who are you?" "Flight Lieutenant James McKenzie, Royal Air Force, serial number 142856. I've just escaped from German captivity." The sergeant lowered his rifle slowly. "Jesus Christ. You look like death warmed over. How long you been walking?" "I don't know anymore, Bington," McKenzie said honestly. "Weeks, months, forever." They took him to their battalion headquarters, where an intelligence officer questioned him, verifying his identity. They gave him food, real food, sea rations that tasted like heaven. They gave him coffee, hot and strong. They wrapped him in blankets and let him sit by a fire. The intelligence officer listened to Mackenzie's account with growing amazement. 5 camps, he said finally. 5 escapes, over 600 miles on foot. "That might be a record, Lieutenant." "I just wanted to go home," Mackenzie said simply. They transported him to a field hospital where doctors examined him with professional concern. Severe malnutrition, hypothermia, frostbite, the old ankle injury, rebroken, but alive. "You should be dead," the doctor said bluntly. "How did you keep going?" "I promised myself I would see home again," Mackenzie said. "I kept that promise." They flew him to England 2 weeks later. As the plane climbed over the English Channel, Mackenzie looked down at the gray water, at the white cliffs of Dover appearing in the distance, and felt something break loose inside him. Not tears. He was beyond tears. But a release, a letting go of tension that had sustained him for 16 months. England looked impossibly green as they descended. The plane landed at an RAF base in Kent, and Mackenzie stepped onto English soil for the first time since October 1943. He returned to his family home in Scotland, to his mother who had believed him dead, to his younger sister, who had grown up in his absence. They welcomed him with tears and joy. How do you explain 16 months of captivity to people who have never experienced imprisonment? How do you describe the weight of wire and walls, the transformation of time into an enemy? How do you convey the desperate determination that drove you across 600 miles of hostile territory? He tried in the weeks that followed. He sat in the kitchen of his childhood home, slowly remembering what normal life felt like. He told them about the camps, about the tunnels, about the escapes. But the words seemed inadequate. At night, he dreamed. Not nightmares exactly, but dreams of walking. Endless walking through snow and forests, always pursued, always searching for freedom. He would wake in darkness, disoriented believing himself back in a camp. Then his eyes would adjust, and he would see his bedroom. He was home. He was safe. He was free. The war in Europe ended on May 8th, 1945. Mackenzie listened to Churchill's victory speech on the radio, surrounded by family and neighbors, everyone celebrating. But he felt oddly detached from the jubilation. For him, the war had ended on March 21st, on that hilltop overlooking American lines. In June, the RAF awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross for his bombing missions. In August, they added a bar to that decoration, recognizing his escape attempts. The medals arrived in the mail with a brief letter. Mackenzie put them in a drawer and didn't look at them for years. What haunted him wasn't the captivity or the escapes, but the men who hadn't made it. The 3 crewmen who had died in the burning Lancaster. The 50 officers executed after the Great Escape. Morrison, bleeding out 200 yards from safety. The prisoner who slipped from the raft into the Danube. He had survived through luck and determination, and perhaps some quality he couldn't name. But survival carried its own burden. The obligation to live for those who hadn't. The need to make his life count for something. In the years that followed, Mackenzie spoke at schools and veterans groups, telling his story not to glorify war, but to honor the men who hadn't returned. He corresponded with families of prisoners he had known, sharing memories. He returned to Stalag Luft III in 1965, 20 years after the war's end. The camp was in Poland now, behind the Iron Curtain, but he obtained permission to visit. The wooden barracks were gone. The guard towers stood empty, rusting monuments to imprisonment. He stood in what had been the North Compound, trying to reconcile his memories with the empty field before him. Here, 10,000 men had been imprisoned. Here, 600 men had dug 3 tunnels with desperate determination. Here, 50 men had died for the crime of trying to be free. "Why did you do it?" a young Polish journalist asked him. "Why risk death when you would have been liberated eventually?" Mackenzie thought about the question for a long time. "Because captivity is a form of death," he said finally. "Not physical death, but spiritual death. Every day behind wire, you lose a piece of yourself." Escape wasn't about reaching safety. It was about refusing to accept that diminishment. It was about saying, "I am still a man, still capable of choice, still free inside my own mind." Mackenzie lived until 1992, dying peacefully at 73 in his home in Scotland. In his final years, he wrote a memoir published posthumously. The book included excerpts from his diary, kept throughout his captivity and escapes, smuggled home in pieces. One entry, dated March 22nd, 1945, the day after his liberation, captured something essential. "I walked into American lines this afternoon, ending a journey that began in October 1943. 16 months as a prisoner. 5 camps, 5 escape attempts, over 600 miles on foot through occupied Europe. They ask me how I survived, what kept me going. Freedom is not a place. It is not safety or comfort or the absence of danger. Freedom is the will to keep walking when every rational calculation says to stop. Freedom is choosing movement over surrender, action over acceptance. I learned this in the camps, in the tunnels, in the frozen forests of Germany. I learned it from men who chose death in pursuit of freedom rather than life in captivity. I learned it from every step of that 600-mile journey. They tell me I am free now, liberated, safe behind Allied lines. But the truest freedom I have ever known come not from being rescued, but from the moment I climbed out of that tunnel at Stalag Luft III and ran for the forest. In that moment, cold and hunted and almost certainly doomed, I was more free than I had ever been. Because I was choosing my fate rather than accepting the fate others chose for me. Freedom is not granted, it is seized. And once seized, it changes you forever. I will never be imprisoned again, not by walls or wire or the tyranny of any state. Because I know now what I am capable of. I know that I can walk 600 miles through winter and enemy territory. I know that I can survive cold and hunger and despair. I know that I am unbreakable. I am free because I chose freedom over survival, risk over safety, struggle over submission. And that choice, once made, can never be unmade. The memoir sold modestly after his death, read primarily by military historians and families of former prisoners. But among that audience, Mackenzie's story became legendary. The man who escaped 5 Nikan camps and walked 600 miles to freedom. His grave in a Scottish cemetery bears a simple inscription: Flight Lieutenant James McKenzie, DFC and BAR, Royal Air Force, 1919 to 1992. He kept walking. The story of James McKenzie stands as testament to a fundamental truth about human nature. That freedom is not a condition, but a choice. That the human spirit, when sufficiently determined, can endure almost any hardship. That the will to be free is stronger than walls or wire, or the might of tyrannical states. He walked 600 miles through occupied Europe because he refused to be a prisoner. He escaped 5 times because each capture was merely a temporary setback. He survived because survival meant maintaining his humanity in the face of forces designed to strip it away. Mackenzie's journey was not just about reaching Allied lines. It was about proving that the human desire for freedom cannot be contained, cannot be defeated, cannot be broken. Every step of that 600-mile journey was an act of defiance. Every escape was a declaration that the individual soul remains sovereign even in captivity. His story resonates because it speaks to something universal. The desire to be free, the refusal to accept imposed limitations, the determination to keep moving forward even when the path seems impossible. For Mackenzie, 16 months of captivity and 600 miles of walking forged an understanding of freedom that most people never achieve. He learned that freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the presence of will. That being free means being willing to risk everything for the sake of remaining yourself. This was the lesson carried back from those 5 camps. From those endless miles through occupied Europe, from that final walk down a hill toward American lines, freedom is not given, it is claimed. And once claimed, it becomes part of your essential nature. James McKenzie walked 600 miles to freedom. But the deeper truth is that he was free the moment he climbed out of that first tunnel. Free the moment he refused to accept permanent captivity. Free the moment he chose movement over stasis, hope over despair, struggle over submission. The rest was simply the physical manifestation of a freedom he had already claimed in his mind and spirit. The rest was just walking. He kept walking. And in that simple act of continued motion, he wrote a story of human endurance that transcends the specific details of World War II and speaks to every person who has ever faced constraint or oppression. His message is clear and eternal. Keep walking. Keep moving toward freedom. Never accept the walls others build around you. Never surrender the sovereignty of your own spirit. This is the story of the POW who escaped 5 Nazi camps and walked 600 miles to freedom. But more than that, it is a story of what it means to be human, to refuse submission, to claim freedom not as a gift but as a birthright that no power on earth can permanently revoke. Flight Lieutenant James McKenzie proved that freedom is not a place you arrive at. It is a decision you make with every step. And he kept walking all the way home.